This is one of the tankiest builds I've ever played, and while it's a little early to call this for sure, it is absolutely feeling like the frontrunner for build of the league. In a lot of ways, this build takes many of the strengths from one of my favorite builds I've ever played, Mahaxaddle's Machination Lightning Strike Champion, adds in a ton more quality of life and removes a bunch of the downsides from that build, and is generally way cheaper and easier to get set up and running. Hi, it's Lerald, and I'm going to talk about Lightning Strike Slayer, but first don't forget to like and subscribe. Okay, let's talk about why this build is special. First off, Lightning Strike is one of my favorite skills in Path of Exile. It is allegedly a melee skill, and it received massive buffs this league along with all of the actual melee skills. But as you can see, it is a bit long-ranged for a melee skill, and it offers both amazing clear for mapping and the ability to continue hitting bosses even when you're pushed out of melee range by mechanics, which is pretty uncommon because you can often just face tank them. You're also able to get the dual nature of scaling from melee and ranged mechanics as well. It's really, really good. I knew going into this league that I wanted to play both Lightning Strike and Slayer at some point because they both received big buffs, and I guess also because Champion received some pretty big nerfs. My initial plan last week was to make a Viper Strike of the Mamba Trickster, I think, and as I was thinking about it, I opened up YouTube to watch some cooking videos from the Brazilian sensation Guga, because that's how I like to relax. At the top of my recommendations was a Mathel video from like 20 minutes earlier of him playing a Viper Strike of the Mamba Trickster. So that plan got scrapped immediately. Maybe I'll revisit it down the line because the build seems pretty great. Anyhow, I went back to the drawing board, and the drawing board had Lightning Strike and Slayer on it. I also had this absolutely insane new shield from one of the league mechanic bosses, the Black Knight, and I was pretty confident I could combine all of these mechanics together in a way that would work and reach the level of the Lightning Strike champions that I've played in the past. In terms of meeting expectations, this build has obliterated them. It rocks. It's all I wanted it to be, and more. And now here's the big reveal. I've been doing all of the content so far in this video with a magic find setup. I've been wearing a gold flask, I've been using an item rarity support in my main 6-link, and I have not been wearing a second taming, I've been wearing a rarity ring. So with all of that replaced with actual real kill boss gear, this is what a 161% more monster life, massive crit chance, more damage, etc. boss looks like in tier 17. Does he also have endurance charges? Maybe not. Either way, he is going down. Even with 261% life, he is getting trashed. And he's just completely face tankable, no danger at all, never really falling below full health. Yeah. Also, this build has amazing visuals, fantastic microtransactions, and now let's kind of do a little microtransaction breakdown here. So the current setup I'm going with, kind of a personal favorite, is the full Nightfall armor set, Nightfall weapon, Nightfall armor, Nightfall wings, all the usual Nightfall stuff. There is no Nightfall shield, so I use the Transcendent shield as well because that matches pretty nicely. Nightfall character effect, you name it, it's Nightfall, nice and purple. Now, one of the big advantages that Lightning Strike has, at least I feel, is that both visually and I think sound-wise, I'll turn on the sound for in-game, it's just a really well-designed skill. It looks great, it sounds great, and I have all of the microtransactions. I think if I had to pinpoint something that I dislike about Lightning Strike, it's that it just needs more MTX. All of the different MTX look and sound very different, as you can kind of see in here, and I even think the default no MTX version looks and sounds pretty good too. Just a really good skill all around. All right, now let's run through the pros and cons of this build, and I'll start with the pros. First off, it is super easy to play. It's very low effort. It's mostly a one-button build with a minimal number of keybinds for cooldowns, that sort of thing, mobility skills, but there's no stop and start playstyle or piano like you get with Warcry Slammers. It's very, very simple. This is also a build that uses a lot of uniques, so gearing it up is pretty easy. It's very easy to manage how to get all the gear. You know, you get this unique, you're done now. The uniques also have a lot of resistances built into them, so there's not a ton of stat pressure either. And for the most part, the uniques that this build uses are not terribly expensive. I would say the only one that's pretty much mandatory that's like fairly expensive would be Ralakesh's Impatience, and just to kind of look at the price of that right now, 2.5 Divines. That's pretty manageable at this point in the league. This build also has tons and tons and tons of defensive layers. It has, just to name some of them, Slayer Overleech, Overcapped Block Chance, lots of evasion, Fortify, Fizz Reflect Immunity, which also applies to Impale damage, Sap, Sand Stance, and 7 Endurance charges. It also has tons of offensive power as well, including 7 Frenzy charges, 3 power charges, Slayer's 20% Culling Strike, along with all of the other benefits that Slayer gets out of killing enemies, and just, in general, absolutely preposterous amounts of damage on a relative budget. You can watch me evaporate this Uber Shaper while I continue on about how good the build is. This all comes from tons and tons and tons of stacking buffs and debuffs that all function as multipliers on your damage output against enemies. This build can run tons of annoying map mods, including some of the most annoying ones in my mind, which would be Reflect, Less Recovery, and No Regen. All of those are not a problem for this build. And then maybe there's the best upside of all. This build has amazing flexibility and scaling potential. There is a lot of stuff that you can do to tweak this build and change it around and make it stronger or cheaper or whatever you want it to be. I am nowhere close to the potential limits of this build. I have massive amounts of upgrades I could still make and would like to make, and I just simply haven't gotten to them yet. Even so, I am shredding Ubers in tier 17s. I played the worst I have ever played on an Uber Maven. Ever. I got hit by her no regen debuff like, I think 6 or 7 times, and I still killed her deathless. I accidentally face tanked a Cirrus Meteor, Uber Cirrus Meteor I should say, and multiple of his die beams, and also still killed him deathless. I did all of the Ubers in the span of maybe 25 minutes. It was incredibly easy. They were still significantly easier than tier 17s, which have not been difficult at all since the nerfs. Now, as for the cons, I really had to scrape the bottom of the barrel to find any. I could have just left this section blank, but I can actually pinpoint a couple of cons for my setup specifically, and here they go. 1, I am not spell suppression capped. I could be, I should be. I'm making it work with Lucky Suppress, and by making it work, I mean that I am face tanking Shaper Balls and Shaper Beams a little bit, and it's fine. Would it be better with 100% spell suppression? Does Ice Cream taste good? Con number 2. Degen effects can be kinda nasty if you don't have anything to leech off of. This is not super common, but it has been the most deadly thing that I've experienced on the build. The majority of my deaths on this character have come from me not having corrupted blood immunity through a jewel and dying to corrupted blood after I dropped my life flask. Pretty funny, pretty stupid, I think. Con number 3, getting your Chaos Res up is fairly difficult. You just don't have that many leftover suffixes to actually cap it and also get everything else you need. This is fine. You do not need to have 75 Chaos Res in order to make this build function, clearly. And I just run Shikari Pantheon anytime I'm doing a Monster's Poison on hit map, and then it is fine. And I guess con number 4, it is a charge stacking build, so you can't do all the Eater of Worlds Eldritch Altar mods. And that is the end for downsides on this build. They're all pretty minor. The core of the build is a group of synergistic unique items that all massively increase your damage and tankiness. So let's go ahead and jump into the gear section of the build. Now, full disclosure, I am using a Mage Blood in the build. You do not need one. You do not need a Mage Blood or a Headhunter. You can use Arn's Anguish instead, and I'll just show that off here. It is this belt. It costs 40 Chaos. Pretty cheap. And if I look in my pub here, it grants, if I pull this up, type this in, Arns. It will grant 23% increased damage. That's without Silver Flask turned on. I'll turn on my Silver Flask here, which isn't totally accurate because it is a Mage Blooded up version, but 42% more damage. Good God. Arn's Anguish is a very strong belt. I will just show it off here and talk about it a bit. It makes it so that your endurance charges are instead brutal charges. Brutal charges give you a 3% chance to deal triple damage and 10% increased stun threshold, which means you can kind of use this to fix both just damage requirements and then also stun. 70% increased stun threshold is actually quite substantial. This is an insane belt for very cheap. It comes from regular Maven, I believe. It also has some other good stats, armor, life, fire res. Now you do have to find a way to get endurance charge generation in the build, and I think the best way to do that is just to take Disciple of the Unyielding. You'll get endurance charges on kill. You will then be rocking around with, yeah, like 40% more damage, pretty ridiculous. Ultimately, that's not the approach that I've gone with here because I have a Mage Blood. I think Headhunter is also really good. I actually think even though Mage Blood provides quality of life in the form of speed and ailment defenses, those are amazing. I do genuinely believe this build is better, faster, stronger, and above all, tankier as a juice map farming build if you wear a Headhunter. This is pretty normal. Headhunter usually is better for speedy map farming than Mage Blood. I just have a Mage Blood. That's it. Now, as for the rest of the gear, you're going to use a Rare Claw that is relatively simple to craft up, and there are kind of several different tiers of how much currency you're going to put into crafting that up, but generally speaking, whether you go for a very cheap one or a very expensive one, the philosophy of crafting them up is going to be relatively similar. You're going to use a Rare Helm, Rare Gloves, and a Rare Chest, all of which will have life and just sort of various suffixes, suppress and resistances, and then maybe some attack speed. On the gloves, you will want the increased damage while leeching crafted prefix. If you can get that on the gloves, that really adds a lot of damage. And then there are some important modifiers, some important Eldritch implicits on the gloves. Projectiles pierce an additional target, non-vol strike skills target an additional enemy. Those are really valuable. On the helm, getting reduced mana cost of attacks, getting increased mana reservation efficiency is really valuable. And then on the chest, you really want to get the Eater of Worlds implicit. Melee hits have a chance to fortify. And if you can get that on the higher level Eldritch currency, I'll show those off here. Some of the Grand Eldritch Ichor, that really makes it a lot easier to maintain max fortify stacks instead of having 6%, I think, is kind of the bottom end of the lesser Ichor. Having about 11% from the higher end of the Grand really does make a big difference. You don't have to go with increased effective non-curse auras from skills as your Searing Exarch implicit on the body armor, but I think it's the best option generally. Now, as for the chest, getting body armor with life on it is obviously good. Armor and evasion aren't really as important. You're mostly relying on blocking and a lot of other defensive layers, but armor can be good, especially if you go in more of the Arn's Anguish approach. If you're going for more of an evasion approach, which is kind of what I prefer, then having good evasion rating is, it's good, it's not bad, but it's not necessarily the most important thing. I think getting chance to block spell damage crafted on your chest probably is the most important thing, and that's because the item that really kind of ties this whole build together and makes a lot of the defenses work is this shield here, Fallen. This thing was like 5 chaos for a while early on in the league. People, I think, didn't recognize just how insanely good it is. It makes it so that your max chance to block, attack, and spell damage is reduced by 10%, so that brings it from 75 down to 65 as your max block, but then it makes your chance to block lucky. And the thing about lucky, kind of doing calculations on lucky, is the way you want to do them is you basically take 1 minus whatever the percent chance is, so 1 minus 0.65. That means your chance to be hit is 35. You then multiply that by itself, and that is the actual chance for the thing to happen. So 12% chance to be hit, so 87, 88% chance to block if you're sitting at max block. Now, I'm actually not sitting at max block. I'm slightly below. I think I'm at 63%, and then I don't have all my auras turned on at the moment. There we go. 63% chance to block, attack, and spell damage. So that would put me at 1 minus 0.63. 0.37 times 0.37 is something like 86%. Yeah, 86% chance to block. That is right on. That is pretty crazy. Now, when you combine that with all of these other defensive layers, the lucky suppress and so on, a lot of people make their very valid point that effective health pool is not an accurate indicator of how tanky you are. Max hit is definitely something that's a lot more valued in the hardcore side of the game, but obviously a 500k effective health pool indicates that this build is pretty tanky. And like, just one of the things that I've done on this build just to kind of demonstrate how tanky it is to myself is I've just walked up to a divine shrine. I've just walked up to it. Hello, fellow kids. How is this divine shrine? Let me just scoot right by you there and grab that real quick. Most other builds cannot do this. You can't walk up to a divine shrine and be alive throughout the process. Now there's another little benefit here of using this Fallen as well. It will trigger socketed elemental skills when you block, which you block often, and so you can actually throw a couple of damaging skills in there, basically just a couple of buffs in there. And the best ones to use, I think, are Flame Wall and Sigil of Power. Sigil of Power will just put a sigil on the ground. You can stand in it, continue using spells, or I guess just Lightning Strike, really. And occasionally it'll gain some stages. And if you're able to actually get it up to maximum stacks, then you can get a pretty substantial amount of less damage on enemies that are in that area. Not super common that actually occurs, but a potential defensive layer. But more, you just get some more damage for each stage. And then the same goes with the flame walls. It'll throw out flame walls. There's a beautiful MTX for them in the form of Transcendence Flame Wall. And if I just drop that in somewhere else, I could show off how pretty that MTX is. If I can find Flame Wall, there we go. Isn't that lovely? Oh yeah. So that'll automatically trigger, and if your Lightning Strike goes through that, then, you know, then it'll add a little bit of extra damage, and that's pretty cool. Neither of these, I mean, well, Sigil of Power doesn't do any damage on its own at all, but Flame Wall doesn't do enough damage for it to be a problem on LE Reflect maps. And then I kind of like to keep Frostblink at level 1 to deal with LE Reflect, just kind of, you know, not trying to have any deaths to LE Reflect. Now, maybe the one limitation that I have right now is because I am a little stupid. I'm not at like 150 whatever int to get these all the way up to max level. There is a little bit of lost damage from the Flame Wall and the Sigil of Power. They could do more if they were at max level, if they were both at 20. But, you know, I think even so, I think they're still pretty good at like level 11, level 14, whatever. I still think that's fine. I did try playing around with a couple of other things. Hydrosphere, I just didn't think it was all that great. And then I wish Tornado worked. Tornado seemed like the perfect thing to run for this build for that purpose. But unfortunately, it is not flagged as an elemental skill. If we look at Tornado, it is physical, unfortunately. So it would be really cool to be able to trigger tornadoes and then hit them and have them reflect a large percentage of all the damage that they take from your lightning strikes into nearby enemies, but it's not elemental, so that just isn't gonna happen. And now for kind of the big trifecta here, you have Ralakash's Impatience. It makes it so you count as having maximum endurance charges and power charges and frenzy charges all the time. This is why you're able to run Arn's Anguish and still maintain all the defensive value of having endurance charges, is by having Ralakash and Arn's together. You'll get the benefits of both. You'll have to actually generate brutal charges and able to benefit from Arn's, but you will have max endurance charges, you'll have max frenzy charges and power charges, and you'll be good to go. And on that note, another way that you can get the endurance charges if you are using Arns, you know, since you won't be able to get them through Ralakash's Impatience, is you can use, instead of the increased effective non-curse auras from skills, you can use a high-level Searing Exarch implicit mod that gives you an endurance charge every 10 seconds. That will, I think, take an Orb of Conflict or two, or several Orbs of Conflict, I suppose, to get that to work. But, you know, that is also a possibility. Getting that endurance charge automatically generating, that can also work for fueling your Arns and then still benefiting from everything else through Ralakash's. Now, you will note that Ralakash has no move speed on it, and this is kind of the big reason that I've stuck with Mageblood, is this is the move speed with no flasks or anything at all going. No move speed of any sort anywhere else in the tree, and that's because, you know, Ralakash just has the two mods. It has some resistances and the unique mod. So, you know, you're able to get around with Whirling Blades. It's fine. It totally works. And then obviously if you are running a Headhunter or just anything that gives you any move speed elsewhere, I mean, normal Quicksilver Flask, then you're fine. But obviously, yeah, it is definitely I guess the one downside of the build that is real. And then here's kind of the big couple of things that all come together. Yoke of Suffering makes it so that you get a bunch of resistances, you get some stats, whatever. The real value here is that you get increased damage for each type of ailment you inflict on enemies, and so you are able to inflict a lot of different types of ailments. We have blind enemies on hit here. This is super valuable for making it so that we can actually guarantee we're hitting enemies, because when enemies are blinded, they have less accuracy and less evasion. This synergizes nicely with our evasion, but it also helps our accuracy be more valuable since enemies now have less evasion. So blind is really good. Super underrated thing. I kind of like this wheel here, the Dazzling Strikes wheel. I just wish that this node were more than just this small amount of a chance to blind. Like if it also had crit chance or some other sort of value, I think I would take this wheel, but as it currently stands, it's not quite there. We are critting a lot. This is a crit-based build, so we're going to be bleeding because we do have a little bit of fizz damage built in to the Lightning Strike. We don't want to get rid of all the fizz damage. And so that means we are able to guarantee that we're bleeding some on enemies, and we're just taking this wheel. This insane new wheel, Cornered Prey, makes it so that we have massively increased crit chance and crit multi on bleeding enemies, and then this Mastery here gives us even more crit chance, so we get a massive amount of damage out of this wheel, and I'll just kind of show that off. Bleeding crit chance, you know, if we drop all of this, we lose like 25% of our damage. So pretty crazy there. I'm also, from this tattoo, getting chance to poison on hit. Since we are doing physical damage, we are able to poison. So we are getting both chance to blind, chance to poison, combined with this incredible value out of crit. So that is 3 different types of ailments that we're able to apply to enemies. And then we also have Secrets of Suffering, which lets us apply Scorch, Brittle, and Sapped. So we have 6 different types of ailments that we're putting onto enemies, and we're hitting very, very frequently. So these are all always active on enemies. So this neck is giving us 60% more damage on enemies, more or less. It's not exactly 60% more, but it's 6 different potential debuffs that are on enemies that are then increasing their damage taken by 10% each. Pretty good. Then we also have the Taming, which makes it so that enemies take anywhere from 30 to 40% increased elemental damage with hits and ailments for each type of elemental ailment on the enemy. And you'll note that this doesn't say that you have applied. So, as I said before, we are taking Secrets of Suffering. That's from the Interrogation, this small unique jewel that comes from Delirium. We're able to inflict Scorch, Brittle, and Sapped, but we can't Chill, Freeze, Ignite, or Shock. So we're able to get Chill and Shock from our Skitterbots, and so as the Taming says, you get increased elemental damage with hits and ailments for each type of elemental ailment on the enemy. Period. Doesn't have to come from you. So you get the 3 from yourself, Scorch, Brittle, and Sapped, and then you get the 2 from your Skitterbots, Chill, and Shock, for 5 times, and then whatever this number is, anywhere from 30 to 40. Getting one of these that's in the like 36 to 40 range is actually not that expensive if they don't have the elemental damage quality up on them already. They are then able to be rolled above 40, and that comes from this catalyst here, Turbulent Catalyst. These are pretty cheap. You just roll 20 of these onto a relatively decent The Taming Ring, get it a 20% elemental damage quality on it, and now you have, let's say, 45% increased, 0.45 times 5. 225% increased damage on enemies, and then you can just run 2 of these rings. You get a roughly 35 or so, 35 to 40% all LE res for each ring. No life or anything, but that's fine. This makes it so that it's very easy to cap your reses. You get 70 to 80 all res out of your 2 rings, then you get another, what is this, like 20 something all res out of your neck. It's pretty easy to get your resistances fixed with this build. You're getting so much just out of your rings and your neck, and then, you know, you can kind of figure out the rest from there. Now, as for the gear, I am using a pretty classic setup of a Quicksilver Silver Flask, and then because I am going Evasion, I'm doing a Jade Flask. As for your other flask, you kind of have a lot of different options. I think for fixing suppression, if you're using a Mage Blood, a Quartz Flask is an option. Maybe not the greatest option, but definitely is an option. I'm using an Amethyst Flask for high-level stuff at the moment just because my Chaos res kind of sucks, and this is definitely one approach for fixing that. For most content, as I kind of mentioned earlier, I've been using a Gold Flask for rarity, for Magic Find. Why not? All right, now let me mention the Tincture. So I am running this in place of a Life Flask. Because this is a Slayer build, you just really don't need the Life Flask. It's an essential. And this Tincture adds a gargantuan amount of damage. We can actually toggle that on and off in the pub and see it adds about 70% more damage when it's active. Whew, my god. And so the way that this works is pretty simple. You turn it on, it will start draining your mana, and you have so much overleach, so much mana sustain, that it really doesn't fall off until you stop attacking, or like, I don't know, 40 seconds have passed, something like that. Now you can roll your prismatic tincture in a lot of different ways, but I kind of like this setup here. Increased effect is really huge. It applies to all of the other positives on the flask, or the tincture, I should say, and the increased mana burn rate, you're just able to sustain through that, so it doesn't really matter. The suffix options, there are several of them, but I think penetrating resistances is probably the best one. It's really huge. And then the implicit is just really, really good. Increased elemental damage with melee weapons, not much more to say about it than that. And then anytime that you are on a big enemy, or really just anytime you're mapping and you think about it, you press your tincture, you start blasting. Whenever it falls off, okay, 8 seconds of downtime, then you turn it back on, continue blasting. This synergizes really, really well with the Vol Lightning Strike cooldown. You pop both together, and you just absolutely shred enemies. I mean, you just turn everything into dust. Tinctures are so good. I am really, really impressed by how good tinctures are. I've become a huge fan very quickly because of this build. All right, now to briefly run through the skills. Obviously, we're going to be using Vol Lightning Strike. That is the preferred one. 2020 is totally fine. And then the pretty standard setup for your supports is Nightblade, Trinity, Awakened Elemental Damage with attacks. Doesn't have to be Awakened, but Awakened level 5 will give you LE damage from supported skills can't be reflected, and that is actually a pretty huge quality of life improvement, so this is something you do want to get. And then Multi-Strike. You can use Awakened Multi-Strike. The cost on those is like, I think, 150 divines, so if you can afford it, you should use it. It is a substantial damage increase, we can see here. Swapping from regular Multi-Strike to Awakened Multi-Strike, yeah, it's like 11% more damage. Pretty great, but not mandatory. Awakened Multi-Strike is never mandatory. It's just good. And then we have Returning Projectiles, and Returning Proj is something that is not ever like capable of functioning in PoB, but it is worth roughly 39% more damage with your projectiles. It also looks nice, and that can't be underrated. Looking cool is definitely valuable. But it really helps a lot with clear. It helps with clearing in front and behind you. It does a lot of damage as well. You know, it adds about 39% more proj damage, even though that doesn't show up in PoB. It's huge. Obviously, you do not have to run this if you're able to get a Nimbus. If you're able to swap out one of your tamings with a Nimbus, if you have that extra 200 divines hanging around, that is a huge damage bonus. Instead of having the 30 or 61% damage loss from Returning Proj, you have 0 damage loss. So huge damage increase, and in that case, I would run Inspiration support. I think that is what I would run instead in that situation, but without Nimbus, you know, not necessary, but oh boy, is it a nice damage increase if you have a Nimbus available to do that. That is definitely something that is kind of a long-term plan for me in terms of upgrading the build. Now, just to talk about some other stuff here, you have Assassin's Mark with Mark on Hit and Life Tap, Quality of Life, make it so that you can afford to use it, pretty standard. I am using Precision with Arrogance. This is really essential for making it so that I can guarantee that I actually hit with all of my attacks, along with some of the other stuff in the tree. And the life loss, the amount of life that we're reserving, really not that important, and it does actually give you increased effect by having it hooked up with Arrogance, 24% increased aura effect. That's actually pretty good. Also a bunch more crit chance, so valuable. I'm using Whirling Blades with faster attacks. One downside here is you do actually deal a lot of elemental damage with your Whirling Blade, so if you're doing an LE Reflect map, you either just want to not use it at all, or switch over to just like a level 1 Void Manipulation support on your Whirling Blade, so it only does physical and chaos damage and can't do any LE damage at all, and thus will not be able to kill you. We have Blood Rage, of course. This is kind of essential. You're going to just flick this on and get the attack speed from it. That's all it's for. And then Flame Wall, that is, you know, I already talked about that. Flame Wall and Sigil Power, those are just in the shield to give you some extra buffs. And then for auras, Summon Skitterbots for the Shock and the Chill. Those are both massive damage increases. Tempest Shield is just there to give you a lot of spell block chance. And Enlighten is there to make these and Anger usable. And then Anger is the best option for a damage aura. It adds a lot of fire damage to your attacks. That's all it does. The only other options that you could maybe use instead are Hatred, which you can afford because it's a dex-based skill, but it was changed to only do Fizz is extra cold, so it's terrible. And then Wrath is an option. Wrath, I think, would actually add more damage hypothetically, since it adds a lot of lightning damage to your attacks. But the problem with it is it has a very high int requirement. So Anger is pretty easy to pull off. It's strength and int. Wrath is not easy to pull off. It's straight int. And most of the time, if you're playing a Slayer, you're just not going to be smart enough to use Wrath. Then you have my preferred setup of Steel Skin with Automation. And that is just a blue and a red together. It's pretty easy to fit into your boots. And Steel Skin really helps a lot with, I mean, for one, it is a defensive layer. Steel Skin, it gives you just a very basic shield that absorbs some damage before it's taken from your life or ES. That's good. But more importantly, it gives you immunity to bleed. And that means you do not have to run the Ralakesh Pantheon that I still haven't even gotten the follow-up for. Some people will run Ralakesh Pantheon and then they'll run Molten Shell and they'll do a whole armor setup. That can work, especially if you're not Corrupted Blood immune. That can definitely work. But since I am CB immune and I do not have immunity to bleed, I'm just sticking with Steel Skin on an automation support. It's flicking all the time, clearing any bleeds, giving me random shields, and that absolutely works. And then finally, we have a level 1 Frostblink, just so that we don't have a lot of int requirement on it and also a lot of damage on it. I don't want to kill myself with an elemental reflect. And then Flesh and Stone is kind of the last aura that I fit in there. And this is always in Sand Stance because the Blood Stance makes it so you do more physical damage. You barely do any physical damage, that's worthless. But the Sand Stance makes it so you take 19% less damage from people that are in melee range with you, like right in this little area, this center area here. And, I mean, that's great. 19% less damage? Good God. That is a lot more damage reduction on top of everything else. 80% block chance and evade chance and so on. So that's pretty much it for skills. Now let's take a look at the tree. And it's a pretty normal tree. I've already mentioned the tattoos, the blind tattoo, and the poison tattoo. Those are pretty normal. I have a Watcher's Eye with crit multi while affected by anger. That's the only thing on it. Pretty good. Just a free damage bonus. We do have Secrets of Suffering in here. I recently added this Cluster Jewel, but I was doing tier 17s without a Cluster Jewel, and it was going completely fine. I do not know why in my POB the +2 all attributes is being listed as an implicit on this Cluster Jewel. I don't know what's going on there. That's fine. As for the Cluster Jewel powers that you want Martial Prowess as your suffix. It'll give you attack speed and accuracy. That's really good. And then Feed the Fury is just the best possible node that you can get on a claw and dagger attack, steal increased damage with hits and ailments cluster. So that is the one that you'll want. And then Fuel the Fight is a really good option. It gives you mana leech and damage while leeching. That's good. There is an alternative, and I'll just show that off here. So there is one other option, Fan of Blades, and it makes it so that you fire an additional projectile whenever you attack with Lightning Strike. This is pretty much essential for Lightning Strike of chaining, or whatever it's called, the Lightning Strike that chains between enemies. It is not as mandatory for regular Lightning Strike, and this is a good thing, because if we look at the Craft of Exile weight for Fan of Blades, it's 51. It is less than 0.5% chance to show up as a prefix. It is incredibly rare to get a Fan of Blades as a prefix on a Cluster Jewel, so the amount of chaos, if you were to just chaos roll it or try to fossil roll it, is somewhere in the range of 25 to 30 divines. So it is an option to get Fan of Blades. It's not mandatory at all. It is very expensive, and because of that, Cluster Jewels that have Fan of Blades and Feed the Fury on them, along with Martial Prowess, the standard expected setup of Fan of Blades, Feed the Fury, and Martial Prowess, are around 25 to 30 divines. So they're pretty expensive, whereas a Cluster Jewel like this one with Feed, Fuel, and Martial Prowess, it's like a couple divines. Pretty cheap. Now, as for the rest of the tree, we're coming over here and we're taking Deflection and the Block Mastery to help fuel a lot of our blocking and also of our spell block chance. I'm taking Golem's Blood because it's some life. We're taking Savagery and Fervor and Frenetic, always taking all these Frenzy charges because we are playing a charge stacker. And then we're taking Testudo. That gives us a ton of block chance. It also gives us life when we block and block recovery. This is all good. And then we're also taking the Shield Mastery that gives us more block chance. This is really valuable. I am taking Leader of the Pack and the Reservation Mastery that gives max all res when you have reserved life and mana, since I'm reserving both life and mana. As I already mentioned, I'm taking this Bleeding Mastery along with Cornered Prey just to get a bunch more crit chance. I'm coming through here, getting Lethal Pride, coming over and taking Weapon Artistry for more block chance and Intuition for more life and Suppress and Evasion rating, Herbalism for more life, Acuity for accuracy, and also a nice little bit of Fortification, that's something. And Heartseeker for a bunch of crit multi, and then this Crit Mastery of 50% increased effective non-damaging ailments is really, really valuable in conjunction with Secrets of Suffering. The Scorch, Brittle, and Sapped all being 50% stronger is super good. Thrill of Battle adds a lot of value, a lot of mana sustain, reduces the cost, and then you can take the Mana Reservation Efficiency Mastery here as well to help fit in all those auras. I have also Anointed Charisma for the same reason. I have a lot of auras, I want to increase their effect, and I want to be able to fit them all in and still have enough mana to throw out a Lightning Strike or two and not have my tincture immediately fall off. I am taking Clever Thief so that I can get the 10% of Leech as instant mastery. This is super important for sustaining your tincture, for being able to run less recovery and no regen maps, and just being able to kind of stand in stuff, face tank stuff. It's really, really good. I am taking Forces of Nature. This Elemental Mastery is completely insane. It is cracked beyond belief. Like, if we look at that in the PoB, it's 14% more damage for this node, about 7% for Forces of Nature. This is a very, very strong cluster here, and it is worth the travel to get over here. Now, prior to coming into the Cluster Jewel, I was over here taking Revenge of the Hunted for more defensive value as well. Good, great, not doing that at present. Obviously, I'm going to take Inveterate, super valuable suppression, and then since my suppression is kind of low, Lucky Suppress gives me another 25% suppression. It's pretty good. Now for a couple of things that might be confusing to some people or cause some questions. One, I am not taking the Attack Mastery that gives you an additional target nearby is hit by one of your non-vol strike skills. Usually people will try to get +2 on their gloves, +2 strike additional targets, and I tried with several Orbs of Conflict. I couldn't get it to go. Ultimately, I've just settled, and it's fine. I've gone with Monsters Can't Block Your Attacks because usually you don't run into a lot of enemies with this, but when you do, or when you have this as a map mod or something, it's brutal. It's horrible. It like completely bricks the build, and so just having that never apply is really valuable. Definitely you can just run with the more generically useful non-vol strike skills, target one additional nearby enemy, and then switch to this whenever it's relevant, but I'm just kind of keeping it like that because, you know, that way the worst case scenario never occurs, and then it's always pretty much fine. Second of all, Mark Mastery. You have a couple of options. This Mark the Prey wheel is very, very strong. It adds a lot of damage against rares, uniques, and bosses. And then you have two really valuable masteries that you can swap back and forth between as needed. Marked Enemy Can't Regen Life. This is super valuable for Maven maps, for Tier 17 maps, which are being annoyed by the Maven. This completely trivializes her. Super good. Counterpoint. Marked Enemy Can't Deal Crits. This makes it so that crit mods on maps are completely useless on bosses, on most deadly rares. Super, super strong mastery option as well. So I'm running this as my generic option, but anytime I wanted to do anything involving the Maven, Mark Mastery, Marked Enemy Can't Regen Life becomes the go-to instead. You don't have to take either of these, they're just good quality of life. And then finally in the tree here, we have our Claw Mastery. We're taking Claws of the Hawk so we can get skills supported by Nightblade, have 40% increased effective elusive. This is a huge damage increase. Nightblade is super, super valuable. Elusive is another really strong defensive layer. Gives us a lot of move speed, a lot of chance to avoid being hit, stacks with block and evasion and all of that. And then we're able to get a bunch more synergy with that by taking this dagger wheel. Even though we're not using daggers, we get 3% move speed for each of these two small points, whatever. And then we get this 40% increased elusive effect from the shadows, which gives us more chance to avoid damage from hits and more move speed from that elusive buff. We're then also able to take the Dagger Mastery, which applies 40% crit multi to all skills supported by Nightblade whenever we have elusive up, which we basically have that up all the time. And as you can see, that is 8% increased damage. So even though this is a dagger wheel that doesn't make sense to take in a claw build, you can see 3.3% more damage per point. Completely insane. Massive, massive damage wheel. Super good for being this weird kind of off meta thing. It adds a ton of move speed, ton of damage, and it's really, really good. Elusive adds a lot of defensive value to the build. All right, then I'll wrap up this discussion of the tree here by just mentioning the Slayer Ascendancy. It's really good. Bane of Legends gives you a bunch of damage on unique enemies, and also just kind of generally while mapping, it also makes it so you can't take reflected fizz damage. And Impale is reflected fizz damage, so you're completely immune to Impale. Damage from Impale. It'll still show up as a debuff, but you do not take damage from Impale at all. Pretty amazing. Headsman gives you 20% Cull, super valuable. Move speed, attack speed when you kill enemies, also really good. Brutal Fervor gives you Slayer Overleech, kind of the legendary Slayer Overleech, 10% reduced damage while you're leeching, which is pretty much all the time. Super strong. And then Masterful Form makes it so that you have +1 to Frenzy charges, and your Endurance charge maximum is your Frenzy charge maximum. So you have this incentive to stack Frenzy charges, and with Endurance charges having been buffed this league, Slayer got this massive buff in the form of Masterful Form now being an incredibly strong notable, when in the past it was, kind of mid, to be honest. All right, now I'm going to run through how to craft the claw. So whether you're trying to craft a very high level claw or just kind of a budget claw, the approach is still going to be fairly similar. For a high level claw, you're going to want to look for a claw that has a fractured damage prefix. It'll be either lightning, cold, or fire added damage, and you're going to want like T1. For lower level, you can just find one that has a lower amount, or honestly, you can just look up, like, instead of a 700 DPS claw, you can just look up like a 550 DPS claw and just see like how much does a 550 DPS claw cost. Probably a couple of divines would be my guess. Less than that. All right. So the ideal claw, the preferred claw, will be an Imperial Claw. It is just the best base. It adds life per enemy hit, and it attacks very quickly, so it just synergizes really well with this build. It also has a good base crit chance. Now, you only need to be level 82 for the Tier 1 Cold, Fire, and Lightning damage mods, and then for Tier 1 attack speed, Tier 1 crit multi, you need to be like in the 70s, so you only need an item level 82 weapon, so that's kind of your floor, your minimum is item level 82 when it comes to looking for a base. And ultimately what you're going to want to do is you're just going to want to use essences to craft that claw up. Get your prefixes set, and then kind of depending on your budget, go from there as to how you want to manage your suffixes. So here's an example claw. We'll start out with a fractured T1 cold damage roll on it, and then I'll regal it up and I'll just hit it with, let's say, Tier 1 essences of anger, or we'll do wrath. Tier 1 essences of wrath. And so I would just roll this for a while until I hit Tier 1 adds fire damage. Now, in my case, I rolled well over the estimated average number, hundreds, thousands of essences, and only ever hit Tier 2 fire damage on this claw, which is very annoying. And I did double check to make sure that the item level was over 82, and it was. It was unlucky. But you'll do this until you are ready to kind of finish up the suffixes. At this point, you have two approaches. You can just, if you want to kind of go with the budget version, the way that I did it, where you just multi-mod it like this, then what you would do is, if you have fully filled out suffixes, then you would have no choice but to annul. But since we don't have fully filled out suffixes, you would just simply craft prefixes can't be changed, and then scour to remove all of those. That's the safest way. If any of these are not attack, like if this didn't exist, if it was just attribute mod, you could roll cannot roll attack mods and then try to annul, since if cannot roll attack mods is on there, you won't be able to annul any attack mods. But in this case, we're just gonna go prefixes can't be changed, nice and safe, scour, and then we would just simply craft can have up to 3 crafted mods, and then craft regular attack speed, which is here, and then crit chance and strength and int, and then there we go. That would be great. This is probably better than the claw that I am currently wearing. In fact, I'm sure that it is. Now, if we didn't want to go this approach, if we wanted to do the actual fancy, nice version of it, then what we would want to do here is we would do prefixes can't be changed, and then you really have two options. You're going to want to basically put one mod on via Harvest, and then another on through a Veiled Orb. Now, the Harvest mod is probably going to be cheaper, so that's the approach I would take. So I would do prefixes can't be changed, and this can get quite expensive quite quickly. And then if we look at our claw, if we look at our claw mods here, I'll pull this up in pathofexile again. One-handed weapons, claw. We're looking at suffixes. So what we want is attack, speed, and crit. And if we hit not attack, if we hit speed and crit, we'll notice that there are only 3 possible mods: attack, speed, regular crit, and crit multi. This is good. So my preferred approach here would be to add remove speed. This means we're only going to get attack speed. So at this point, what I would do is I would add remove speed and hope that I get a high enough attack speed value that I'm happy with it. Now, if I don't, I would do prefixes can't be changed and scour, and then prefixes can't be changed and add remove speed. As I said, this could get prohibitively expensive very quickly. Now, you could do reforge speed, but the problem with doing a reforge speed is you can then get other mods in here that would ruin things. So this is why this is, again, quite an expensive approach to it. Once you've done this and you're happy with it, at this point, I would then craft, kind of have up to 3 crafted mods, and prefixes can't be changed, and hit it with a Veiled Orb and hope it hits one of the crafted mods instead of the attack speed. You are going to have to hope here, but as we can see here, that did actually work. So I would then take this over to the crafting bench, remove the crafted modifier, and then, because we're trying to unveil crit chance with strength and intelligence, what we want to block from the Veiled mod pool is any of the damage over time multiplier mods. So we would go to the crafting bench and craft whatever mod level of chaos dot multi that works. That'll block all 4 of those dot multis from unveiling. You can see here. And now we unveil, we hope for crit chance or attack speed while a rare or unique enemy is nearby. That'll work. And then we would just simply craft on to finish off the weapon. As far as I'm concerned, I would just simply craft on crit chance, strength, and int. And then there we go. Let's compare that to the claw that I have. It's going to be a pretty substantial upgraded damage, 17% more damage. Whew, yeah, all right. Anyways, so that is kind of the approach that I would be taking for crafting a more or less end-game version of a weapon for this build. It could definitely get very expensive if you're unlucky, but, you know, it could definitely work out to being a pretty nice weapon. Now, for just kind of the cheaper version, I would basically just do the same thing, but I would just settle for less. I would just start out with, whatever. Let's say tier 2 fire damage. Prefix. And then basically just run through the same process as before. Regal. Hit it with anger or wrath or whatever. I guess not anger. Wrath or hatred, one of those 3 mods until I either get triple elemental damage prefix, or really that is all I'm gonna want to have is triple elemental damage prefix. A crafted elemental damage prefix is gonna be a lot worse than a native one, but this would actually be this is actually a very good base, considering that I was just kind of throwing together a cheapo option here. I would just craft attack speed onto this, and yeah, this would definitely get you going for quite a while. You'd be able to take on tier 17s, I think, with a weapon like this if I can find attack speed, increase attack speed, and then I would probably just slam an exalt on resistance. Why not? That can definitely help while you're getting geared up initially. Yeah, 3% damage off from the one that I'm shredding Ubers with. Like, that ain't bad. So for enchanting your weapon, you have a couple of options. I think the standard one that most people do, most people I've seen playing Lightning Strike Slayer do, is just add lightning damage. This will give you more damage on your weapon. It's pretty basic. It is, I think, generally a little better than adding fire or cold damage, but obviously you could do any of those. They're all fine. I have gone with this one right here. Enemies killed by your hits are destroyed, and the reason for this is it functions just like the Axe Mastery. If you kill an enemy, they then cannot be corpse exploded by Revenant monsters in tier 17s or by ambush, strong boxes. They're just simply not capable of doing any of their own death effects. Porcupines don't do anything, corpse explosions, blah, blah, blah. None of that works. And I think that's worth giving up, 3 to 5% more damage to never have to deal with any on-death effects. Good God, I'd give up 20% more damage to not have to deal with on-death effects. So I think that's a pretty fair trade. As for leveling, I used Fez's Bama. That's Blink Arrow, Mirror Arrow, speed leveling strategy. This is not my own strategy or creation at all. I followed their guide. It is a forum guide. I can link to it. I will not link a POV of it. I feel weird linking somebody else's POB, but you should definitely check it out. It is purely for the purposes of getting through the campaign quickly, and I found it to be very effective for that. Now, I made some pretty significant changes to the way that they set up. I was able to, they recommend this as a ranger setup, starting from the ranger start. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to do that if I'm playing a duelist, but the distance to the bow mastery to get blink arrow and mirror arrow cooldown recovery rate is the same, and that is exactly what I did. I came over here, got that at level 10, and then at level 10, I switched over to blink arrow and mirror arrow of bombarding and prismatic clones, or whatever they're called, and immediately went into that and pretty much just committed to the bit. For the whole run, the one big change that I did make was I hated the way that the playstyle was in terms of mana cost. I was just mashing my mana flask the entire time. That was driving me insane. Definitely something I hated compared to playing a typical Smite Hollow Palm leveling setup, which I will admit I enjoy more. I think I would still recommend Smite Hollow Palm more, and we have made guides on Smite Hollow Palm, so I can link a POB of that. But the one thing that I did change for this was I came down and I took this wheel here, the Spirit of War wheel, just to reduce the cost of Blink and Mirror Arrow, and then also the Mana Mastery to reduce the mana cost of skills. And then once I got up in this area, took Shaper for more mana regen and Dreamer for more mana regen and reduced the cost of mana cost of skills, and then also took the Mana Mastery for 5 mana per second, and then committed to the rest of this. And it was fine. I had 0 deaths. I leveled to the end of the campaign in under 3.5 hours while not having practiced this at all. And I thought it went, pretty smoothly. I thought that was pretty quick. But as soon as I got into maps, like the very first second of doing maps, I instantly got killed by something. So I stopped, respec out of this and into Lightning Strike. And then the rest was the character that I am now playing. So I must admit, this was very successful when it came to speed leveling. I did not enjoy it as much as I enjoy Smite Hollow Palm, but that's a lot more familiar, and I think more in line with what the build actually will play like long term. This is just the ultimate way to get to the end of the campaign as quickly as humanly possible, and I must admit it was successful on that front. All right, now just to kind of wrap up with some of the last little bits of stuff here. As for the Pantheon, I am using Soul of Lunaris since I am ailment immune. You can use Soul of the Brine King if you're not ailment immune. That'll definitely work. That will help with other stuff like stun immunity as well. Stun recovery totally helps. Is pretty great. But if you are ailment immune, then Lunaris works just fine. Now, as for your minor Pantheon, you got a lot of options. I kind of leave Shikari on a lot of the time just to make sure that I don't suddenly get killed by chaos damage over time effects on the ground or random poisons or whatever. It's pretty good for that. Aberrath Pantheon's obviously good if you're doing red altars. That's really good for immuning burning ground. The only other things that I would say maybe really kind of factor in is Soul of Ralakesh if you're not corrupted blood immune is good. And then, Gruthkol getting fizz damage reduction every time you're hit, that's pretty generically useful as well. As for bandits, I kill them all, pretty normal. So in conclusion, this build absolutely rules. It has massive quality of life, it is tanky, it hits hard, and it really just has no weaknesses at all. I cannot endorse it highly enough. And I feel that way about all of the individual components of the build as well. Svalin rules, getting over 80% block chance with minimal block investment is insane. Slayer rules, Overleech, the speed, the endurance charges, it's amazing. And then Lightning Strike rules, it gets melee damage scaling while being a ranged skill. What an insane skill. For most skills in PoE, people get bored of playing them over and over. That was certainly the case for Detonate Dead. But Lightning Strike has just not had that same effect on people. It was good before the patch, it is great after the patch, and this is probably the strongest all-around build in the game right now when you factor price into the equation. I know that Molten Strike of the Zenith has gotten a lot of love for being very strong in deep delving, but the budget required to get that build operational is orders of magnitude higher than this one. So I am definitely going to play other builds and see how I feel about them as the league progresses, but right now, it is Lightning Strike Slayer's gold medal to lose. My advice is this: play it while it lasts. I don't expect Svalin to go into the next league at this power level. If it even gets added to the core drop pool at all, it'll probably be very rare and very expensive. Lightning Strike and Slayer could both go unchanged. This seems a little unlikely to me, but it's possible that one or both of them could manage to avoid nerfs in the next league, but There's just really no reason not to play Lightning Strike Slayer in this league. It is the king of Ray class right now. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.